Aristotle Kallis is a professor of European modern history at Keele University. He joins us now from Edinburgh. Thank you so much for your time. When we talk about the rise of the far right, is it really about the rise of fascism or the inability of liberal political systems to address socio-political issues?
Obviously, it's both. But if I had to choose one of the two, I would say that normally, historically, as well as in contemporary times, the rise of this kind of populist, extreme, and radical movements um, is facilitated by the crisis in mainstream politics. So the failure of the liberal political system, of liberal institutions, of liberal economies, if you like, as well as of liberal international law to deliver what most people would consider a viable and positive political system. So it is the crisis of mainstream politics that gives the space for radical and indeed, in some respect, fascist movements to grow.
And of course, we're seeing some of those movements grow in a country like France, and they've got elections coming up next year. Two candidates, Marine Le Pen, Eric Zemmour now. They both seem to have similar beliefs, but have actually been quite scathing towards each other. Does this show some sort of division among the far right, particularly in that country?
The far right historically has always been very, very divided. It's a very personality-driven kind of political force. So yes, of course, the ideology is there. And as you say, both Le Pen and Zemmour share pretty much the same political and ideological space. But because it's so founded on the power of the personality, you have two very strong figures there. It's very easy for this political force to be divided and divisive in many ways. I would say that Le Pen and Zemmour have one major difference, and this is the reason why Zemmour has stepped forward. Le Pen has tried to, as we call it, detoxify the far right or the radical right in France, and there has been a lot of backlash from the traditional voters of the party, from her father indeed. And Zemmour is giving expression to this kind of different approach to the far right, that we don't need to seek to appeal to more centrist voters. We need to really hammer the message to our traditional base. So it's not surprising. It doesn't happen only in France. It happens in other countries. But yes, indeed, it is dividing the vote of the far right.
Do you expect them to make gains come next year's election in France?
It's always very difficult to predict. I think collectively they will make gains. It's already very, very much evident that if the two parties were actually fighting in a single ticket, they will be pretty much at the moment on the same percentage with President Macron. I think the far right is going up and down. We sometimes use the elections only as a gauge of the power of the far right. I don't think that's right because, right now the far right is doing fairly well, but maybe a few months earlier wasn't doing that well, or maybe that happens in the future. We have to accept that there's a hidden, very strong demand for far right ideas and politics that every now and then will express itself in elections. But sadly, it's much bigger than the number of people that vote for these parties.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the sheer support that the far right has across Europe in particular. Is there a particular type of person who supports far right ideology? I mean, a breakdown of who that person may look like, or is it more general?
I think it is far more general these days, given that so many people have at some point either considered or indeed done so, vote for the far right. So it's a bit more difficult to generalize these days. First of all, there are two slightly different groups. There are people who go for the really extreme far right parties, and they're different. I think the more closer to our discussion here is the radical parties, the people that feature in your presentation, Orban, Le Pen, and so on and so forth. And they have become much more varied in many ways. They're people who also lost from the previous economic crisis, but they're not just the people who have been affected by economic crisis. There's also a group of people who are more affluent in that respect, but express this kind of cultural insecurity that is quite pervasive now among European countries, a hatred of immigrants, a hatred of otherness, whether it is Islam or whether it is anti-Semitism in a country like France. All these things play a very important role in creating this sense of insecurity amongst the voters. And it can be economic insecurity, but in most cases, it is this kind of cultural insecurity that our identity is being threatened by those foreigners, and also increasingly in the last 10 or so years by international institutions like the EU, for example, or the United Nations, but particularly the EU.
Very much the fear of the unknown among so many people. Professor Aristotle Kallis, really appreciate your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.